Okay, we've seen the aggregate offer curve and how the ISO equates demand and supply. Now let's talk about how each firm actually thinks about the market, their residual demand curves. So firms face downward sloping residual demand curves. What is a residual demand curve? That's what we're going to talk about. Residual demand is the difference between the market demand and the supply curves of all the other firms in the market. Unlike almost any other industry in electricity markets, the residual demand can be directly observed, at least ex post. That means after the fact, after the market is cleared. We calculate residual demand as the difference between the system demand and the aggregate offer curve of all other generators. So let's look at how this is. Let's construct the residual demand curve for firm 1. So first, we start with the aggregate offer curve. This is the offer curve for all the firms in the market. That's the rightmost dark line here. That's we did this in the hand-drawn example and in the first lecture from this module. This is the aggregate offer curve for all the firms in this market. The aggregate offer curve for all generators except firm 1 is going to be this line over here, the left. And the difference between these two is going to be the offer curve for firm 1. So we're taking the aggregate offer curve, subtracting off the offers for firm 1, and that gives us the aggregate offer curve for all generators except firm 1. So now let's look at the aggregate offer curve of all generators except firm 1, this line here, relative to the system demand, this line here. So all generators, their total supply at, let's say, $300, what they're willing to supply at $300 is 3,350 megawatts. The difference there is going to be 1,050 megawatts. The difference between the system demand and what they're willing to supply. So this is the leftover. What's the residual demand for firm 1? Because this aggregate offer curve does not include firm 1. What's left over here, how much is demanded at that particular price, is left over for firm 1. So that's where we get the residual demand from. So another example, at $50 per megawatt hour, all firms except firm 1 are willing to supply 2,560 megawatts. The leftover, or the residual, at $50 per megawatt hour is 1,840 megawatts. So we can use these values on the right-hand side, the differences, the residuals, to construct a residual demand curve. And that's what we're doing here. So at $300 per megawatt hour, we have a residual demand of $1,050 per 1,050 megawatts for firm 1. At $50 per megawatt hour or megawatt, we have a residual demand of 1,840 megawatts. So this gives us firm 1's residual demand curve. Notice how it's not perfectly inelastic. That gives us something to work with if we're firm 1. This demand curve has some elasticity, and it comes from the elasticity of the supply on the previous slide. It's not from the elasticity of the demand. So now we can take firm 1's offer curve and intersect that with the residual demand curve, and that gives us the system average price of $120 per megawatt hour, which we saw before in lecture 1. So in this case, firm 1, if all other firms are price takers, they're just taking whatever price firm 1 gives. If firm 1 is the residual supplier, they can set the prices at whatever they want, right? Because they are the last supplier, they are the residual supplier. They can charge whatever they want, and that's going to be the system price. So how do firms choose the offer curves to submit? There's no requirement for firms to submit their marginal cost curve, and generally it will not be optimal for them to do so. So in these markets, firms might not be submitting their marginal cost. They might be submitting something higher than the marginal cost. What is this called? Well, sometimes it's called a monopolist, sometimes it's called an oligopolist, sometimes it's called average cost pricing. But in any case, they're not necessarily doing what we might have thought they would have done from microeconomics. Willing to supply at their marginal cost. The difference between the optimal price and the marginal cost will depend on the elasticity of the residual demand curve. So on the previous slide, we saw that residual demand was not perfectly inelastic. It had some curvature. And so that elasticity is going to define how much higher prices are from marginal costs. Firms do not observe exact residual demand when they submit their offers, so they're just guessing. And firms' offer curves have multiple steps and will pass through each possible residual demand realization at the optimal price. So let's look at how this is constructed. All right, here we have a plain old monopoly market. We have a marginal cost curve. The only difference between this market and regular monopoly market is we're dealing with a residual demand for firm 1, right? Or maybe in period 1. And how is the firm setting the prices? Well, they're doing so where their marginal revenue intersects their marginal cost. Remember we figured out how to calculate marginal revenue, I think in Module 2. So the price is determined based on the intersection of their marginal revenue curve and their marginal cost curve, not where that would be in a perfectly competitive market here, where marginal cost intersects demand. Here's another example, maybe firm 2. So firm 2 has a residual demand curve, just like firm 1. We could have done the process that we did in the previous slides for firm 2 instead of firm 1. Firm 2 is likely doing this, and they're going to set their, or construct their offer curves where the intersection of their marginal revenue based on their residual demand intersects their marginal cost. So how does this offer curve end up being produced by a firm? Let's consider the case where the firm is guessing two different demands, two different residual demands. So we have residual demand 1 and residual demand 2. And they're going to set the prices where their marginal revenue from each of these residual demand curves intersects their marginal cost curve. So if we drew the marginal revenue curve in here, it would cross right about there. So that would be the marginal revenue curve for the residual demand 1. For residual demand 2, we could have drawn that in there as well, but to save on clutter, we didn't do it. So here is where the second marginal revenue curve would intersect with the marginal cost curve, and so we get two different prices for two different residual demands, and the intersection of those gives us the offer curve, the solid dark line. If the residual demand is less or more elastic, then our offer curve would look like this. And if our residual demand curves are completely elastic, then our offer curve is just going to be a marginal cost curve. So this should give you a sense of how firms can manipulate the prices in wholesale electricity markets. They can calculate or they can estimate their residual demand curves and then calculate their marginal revenue and then produce an offer curve that has prices according to what their marginal revenues would be instead of what their marginal costs would be. Now this might be the case in some markets like maybe California, where you have a small, relatively small grid with maybe 7 to 10 producers. But if you go to a much larger grid, the MISO, the Midwestern Interconnected Region, you have up to 100 to 500 producers, and so this might not really hold water when you have that many firms competing. So this largely depends on the number of producers in the market. How well this works depends on the number of producers actually in the market. Your residual demand curve isn't really going to be that important when you have 500 other producers willing to produce at some price lower than you. So what these firms are really hoping is that they can end up being the marginal producer, which means they can set the price in the market. And if they are the marginal producer, then they can set the price as high as they want, up to some cap. Okay, so readings for next module. Please read the Economist article, A State of Gloom.